Okay, good morning, everyone. Again, I apologize for adding further confusion to, I'm sure, what is a confusing week. I know we said we would start this class, we would be teaching this class through Zoom, but I've been asked to switch to Teams, so we will meet here on Teams every Tuesday and Thursday morning. Just a couple of reminders about how this course works. At the beginning of class, or a few minutes before class, I will add an attendance sheet for today. So if you arrive a few minutes early, please be sure to click over to the spreadsheet, which will be editable during class time. And please type your name in here so we know that you're present. And speaking of your presence, again, if you have the internet bandwidth, I'd like to ask you to turn on your video so we can create the illusion that we're all together in a classroom as best we can. It definitely helps me instead of talking into an empty screen, so thanks for that. Other reminders, you had a quiz that was due at 11:59 p.m. last Tuesday night. We have a quiz every day that there's a lecture. If you've just joined the lecture and you missed the quiz, or you have other questions about how to catch up, please email me or the TA and we'll get you oriented. As promised, I record every lecture, so you can now find the video lecture from Friday's class up on YouTube at the link here. If you're unsure about any of the details about how we do this class, please click through to there. Okay. I assigned you deliverable 1, in which you'll be installing and starting to play around with Leap Motion device. Any quick questions about the Leap Motion device? You can either type something into chat or raise your hand and unmute yourself and ask your question. So far, so good? No questions so far? Okay. All right, so carrying on with the lecture material, we're going to finish the, will office hours be on Teams or Zoom? For the moment, office hours will still be on Zoom. If you go to the syllabus, you'll see there's remote office hours, just as a reminder. If you click on My Office Hours, you can see that you can sign up for office hours, and during office hours I will link a Zoom link to your name, and that's an indicator that you can click on the link and come join me in Zoom. If that becomes overly onerous, we will switch to Zoom, but for now just hang out in the waiting room here for office hours, and I'll send you a link where you can join me one-on-one for office hours. Sound good? Okay, so again, just back to lecture material. We're going to finish slide deck number 1 today, just sort of an overview, which again is logistics and expectation, and then we'll finish our discussion about why study HCI. And then today we'll spend most of our time talking about the basics of human-computer interaction. Okay, any other questions before we jump back into lecture material? All good? Okay, so we were talking about two reasons so far about why you might want to take HCI. First of all, there's some very high-paying and interesting jobs in HCI. And we ended last time by talking about a second reason, which is, as we all know, we're in the current data flood. There is more data out there than we know what to do with it. There are a lot of challenges out there about how to extract meaning from all the raw data that is being generated every day. And that requires both technical acumen, the ability to program and wrangle that data. There are data science classes here at UVM about the technical side of dealing with large amounts of data. But as the Gapminder website makes clear, there are also creative challenges. How do you actually visually present that information in such a way that the user is not overwhelmed by the amount of information that is there? So as just an example of this, we ended last time with this Gapminder example. There's a lot of information here. However, there is relatively little text. So because this is a good visualization, it doesn't require a lot of textual explanation about what you're seeing on the screen, and hopefully with relatively little effort you can extract some of the patterns that are inherent in this particular data set, which is plotting an economic indicator, GNP, against a health indicator, life expectancy in years, for most of the major countries on Earth. We ended last time by looking at one particular dynamic that you can see here. I've highlighted two particular countries, China and United States, and you can see that the economic improvement of China seems to be increasing at a faster rate than that of the United States. You'll notice that in each of these trajectories, we have a number of circles, and some of these circles are including other circles. What does the size of the circle represent? Again, you can either type it into chat or unmute yourself and just offer an idea. What does the size represent? So size represents population, although I believe nowhere on this plot does it actually say that. How do you know that the size of the circle represents population? What's the clue? China has the biggest circle. The assumption of the person that created this website is that most people would know that the population of China is greater than the United States. So whether you may have realized it or not, there was an assumption on the part of the designer, and hopefully most of you realize that. The colors match the map, that's true. So obviously color represents geographic region, and size represents population. And obviously, as you can see in this plot, the larger the circle, the smaller the population in that country, right? And vice versa. The larger the population in that country, the smaller the circle. Just testing that everybody's awake this morning. Of course, it's the opposite. The size of the circle represents population. Why is that? Why did they choose, in this case, to represent larger size with greater population? It seems like such an obvious choice. It might seem strange that I'm even asking this question. It's intuitive somehow. Why is it intuitive? What we're going to spend a lot of time doing in this class is addressing some things that may seem obvious on the surface, but they rest on assumptions that it's not always obvious. We instinctively associate larger with bigger, right? So as Amanda just said here, there's a metaphor here, which is larger, the bigger the circle, the larger the population of that country. You'll notice that it's a metaphor between something that's relatively concrete and explicit, which is the size of the circle. You can see that directly in the plot, but it's representing something that is abstract. We can't actually see the entire population of a country. So we're using a metaphor. We're drawing something explicitly that represents something that is abstract or implicit. In the case of population size and circle size, that visual metaphor seems very obvious. There are some less obvious visual metaphors that are also represented in this figure. There's some aspect of the way things are drawn in this figure that are meant to represent a more abstract concept. Can anybody see what some of those additional visual metaphors are that may be less obvious than population size equals, that circle size equals population size? Could be color. They may have chosen color to represent something about the culture of that part of the world. Jillian says opacity, and so does Joseph. So let's focus on opacity at the moment. What is it about the opacity that's being represented? Why are some circles filled in and some are partially translucent? Some are opaque and some are translucent. So they're using size to represent one piece of information, as we just described. They're using opacity to explain something else. Prasida says comparing them together. Exactly. So if you play around with Gapminder, you can click on a subset of countries and then drag the time slider bar at the bottom of the screen back and forth to draw a trajectory and focus your analysis on a subset of countries. What else? What other aspects of this figure are representing something abstract? Some are more subtle than others. We've talked about size, opacity, color. Line weight, yeah, possibly. I think in this figure, all the line weights are the same width, but that's a good observation. We could use that visual detail to represent some additional piece of information. So Ethan mentions time for the repeated circles. So if we focus on the trajectories for a moment, we see obviously that there are multiple circles in the trajectory. What does each circle in the China trajectory represent? Something about time, but what aspect of time? Again, it doesn't say. Seems like a year, right? So again, there's tags here for 1975 and 2004. There look like there's about 30 or 40 circles for each of the two trajectories here. It's probably per year, which makes sense. I cheated a little bit because the tags are close to the bottom left of each of the trajectories, which is indicating that the bottom left of the trajectory is where the trajectory starts and moves to 2004. You'll notice that in each trajectory, all of the circles are occluded except the topmost circle in the trajectory. So occlusion, the fact that certain circles are occluding or covering up others, is another visual metaphor. What is it representing? Why isn't the top right red circle occluded and the bottom left circle is the one that is not occluded? So David says the lower you are in the stack, the further back in time you are. Exactly. So just like circle size equals population size, here occlusion represents further into the past, or more occlusion represents further into the past. Less occlusion means closer to the present. Like with circle size, why is it that circles that are closer to us in the present are less occluded and those further into the past are more occluded? Why not the opposite? Occlude data points that are closer to us here in the present. Why that choice? Two ways we could have used occlusion to represent the passage of time. Why isn't the top right circle here, which is 2004, the one that's furthest towards the back, and the one down here, which represents 1975, why is that not the one that is non-occlusioned? So Sarah says the natural progression. Why is it natural? Your brain is probably suggesting to you that that is natural, that's the obvious choice. But again, in HCI, we're going to drill down into human psychology, and we need to understand why most of us feel that this is the natural way to do that. Nolan says because it probably has to do with the user's intention, what they want to get out of this picture, which is to see all of the information about the most recent object, right? So generally speaking, we're probably interested in health and wealth in countries that are closer to us in time than further away. David says the occluded ones are harder to see, which mimics how we forget the details of the past. Exactly. So that choice of occluding things that are further in the past is again exploiting some aspect of human cognition, which is obviously things that are further into the past are more occluded from us. If I asked you what you had for breakfast this morning, assuming you've had breakfast already, you could probably tell me. If I asked you what you had for breakfast yesterday, you might be a little more hazy. Last week, last month, last year, last decade. Things that recede into the past are more occluded in our memory than things that are closer. So another visual metaphor, this one resting also on some aspect of human memory and human cognition. Okay. Sarah points out something else, which is obviously if it was covered up or if it was included, we wouldn't be able to see the objects that come after it, right? So that's also related to this idea of the fact that memory is involved in this particular visualization. Okay, we'll spend a lot of time talking about visual metaphors in this class. We'll also talk about sense metaphors other than visual ones, like auditory metaphors and tactile metaphors. We'll get there. Okay. So let's carry on. Obviously, the way that we plot information, if we're plotting data, we are trying to extract patterns from that data. Why are we trying to extract patterns from that data? Because we're hoping that that becomes actionable. We're hoping that there is a pattern. We make it easier for our users to seek patterns in the data and hopefully come up for explanations or causal mechanisms why things happened, and that might suggest what we might want to do next. Here's an example of a particular pattern that you can draw out of Gapminder relatively easy. Again, where it's a trajectory of actually two different health indicators for China. Children per woman, fertility rate, how many children are born to each woman, and the life expectancy in years as we saw before. What's happening in this particular trajectory? What is the pattern that is being shown here? So we're starting in 1960 as before and moving forward in time to 2004. You can see that there was a particular pattern occurring in China in 1960, 61, 62, 63, which is increase in fertility rate. Women were having more children per woman. Life expectancy was increasing. And then there was a sudden reversal. Fertility rate started to drop and has continued to drop up to 2004. As Ethan mentions, this is the China's one-child policy, which was instituted in 1963-64. I'm hazy on the details. So relatively quickly, we can see the impact, at least the reproductive impact that policy had on this country. Did it have an impact on health, as represented by life expectancy? Did the one-child policy alter the life expectancy for members of the for Chinese citizens? Possibly. We have to look at sort of the rate of increase on the vertical axis along here and along here. As Willem says, it's somewhat unclear from this graph. One of the differences between HCI and just traditional visualization, a data plot, is that most good HCI visualizations are interactive. As I mentioned, if you go to the Gapminder site, you can drag this horizontal time bar back and forth. You can actually interact with the data in real time, and you can, by manipulating the visualization, you can look for evidence for or against a given hypothesis. So I've posed a hypothesis to you, or a question to you, which is, did the one-child policy impact health of the population as a whole? It's not exactly clear from this. However, we might be able to click on and bring up other variables here to test that hypothesis. David's dropped a link here to some animations that you can find in Gapminder. One of the other things I like about Gapminder, which we'll talk about later, is again this interactive process, right? Human-computer interaction, as we're going to talk a fair bit about today, is an interactive process. It is not a one-way process. It is not meant to be something that is projected onto a passive observer. How do we create interactive visualizations to make it easier for the participant, the human participant, to pose hypotheses to the data and then interact in such a way to look for evidence for or against that hypothesis. I'm going to spend a fair bit of time talking about that when we get to visual design. Okay, if we're talking about visualizations, here's a more recent example. I will draw many examples throughout this course from the pandemic. I'm sure that will be true in other courses. Just a proviso here. We're going to analyze various aspects of the pandemic from an HCI point of view. I want us all to keep in mind that this is a very real, very dangerous, and very upsetting ongoing event for many of us. So just keep that in mind. Okay, you've probably seen plenty of COVID-19 dashboards by now. Hopefully towards the end of this course, you will be able to look at those dashboards with a more professional eye and be able to assess whether they are doing a good job or not. Again, it depends on the user. It depends on the participant. If a participant comes to a COVID-19 dashboard, what is it that they most want to do, understand, and or see? That question should drive your decisions about what to include in a dashboard and what not. Okay, a lot of challenges there. Okay, last reason why you might want to study HCI, which is that HCI or interactive technology will soon be everywhere all the time. That's the 2019 version of the slides. I've updated this to say now HCI is everywhere all the time. Here's my little cartoon of this idea. Way back in the Stone Age, about 15 years ago, 15, 20, 25 years ago, most humans did not have a computer or a smartphone. Few people had computers in the 80s and 90s. Moving forward, many more people had more computers and then started to have more cell phones. You can go into Gapminder and actually plot the number of computers or the number of cell phones per individual by country. And you'll see something interesting, which is in most of the developing countries, most individuals have a cell phone or more than one cell phone, and few have a desktop or laptop. Okay, that was kind of a surprising event a few years back. As I mentioned in this class, we're going to spend relatively little time talking about traditional technologies like desktops and laptops. We're going to look at other kinds of interactive technologies that require or challenge the user to interact with them in different ways. One class of technologies we'll look at are embedded devices. So this is any device that is directly sensing the environment, rather than a desktop or a laptop, which is usually passively waiting for the user to type something in or move the mouse. So embedded devices are, in a fundamental sense, more active than a desktop or laptop. They are actively drawing information directly from the physical world. Simplest example of this are intelligent light sensors in the Davis Center, for example. The room is dark, you move in, it immediately detects movement and turns the lights on. When the Davis Center was first built, they had to go back and alter some of the parameters inside the embedded devices because the designers of the light sensors in the Davis Center did not take into account the kinds of activities that were going to be carried out in some of the rooms of the Davis Center, which are classes. So you have an instructor at the front who may or may not be very, very active as he or she is lecturing, and you have a lot of students that are sitting quietly in the classroom or around a set of tables. If nobody moved for a minute or two, all the lights in the room would go out. Okay, so that was kind of an interesting aspect, and again, as in HCI, we need to think carefully about who is going to be using that technology, interacting with that technology, and in which way. Okay. Finally, we'll spend some time talking about robotics, partly because that's my area of research expertise, but also because robots themselves are an interesting class of interactive technologies. Like embedded devices, they are able to directly sense the environment using sensors, but unlike embedded devices, they are also active. They are able to move themselves about their environment. So we're not quite here yet. The world basically looks like this. There are relatively few autonomous robots in our everyday environment, with the exception of maybe the robot vacuum Roomba. But we're moving towards a world that looks like this. In this world, humans are interacting with not just more devices, but more different kinds of devices. And that complicates things in an interesting way for an HCI designer. Okay, so that finishes lecture 1. We'll move on now to lecture 2, where we're going to just talk about the basics of HCI. What are sort of the historical foundations for this aspect of computer science? Okay, so we'll start with the name of the field itself, human-computer interaction. HCI is basically, in one sentence, about how to allow humans and computers, or maybe we should say humans and interactive technologies, to interact towards some common goal. How can a technology have a goal? We'll talk about that also. But again, I want to focus on this issue of goal. The user is trying to do something, and they are trying to use this interactive technology to do that thing better, faster, more consistently, with more people, and so on. There's something they want to do. They may or may not be able to do that task without the technology. So they are adopting it with the hope and the expectation that that technology will allow them to do that better. Like we saw in the Gapminder example, that might just be trying to look for patterns in vast amounts of data. Okay, so let's focus now on humans and computers. I'll use computers at the moment just for short form for any sort of interactive technology. Humans and computers are similar at a very high level, but the similarity will stop at this high level. What do they share in common? Both humans and computers receive input in some way and produce output in some way. And then in between, they process information, right? Information comes in, we cogitate, computers compute, and then we act on the world. What are the input devices? Let's start with humans to begin with. What are some of the input devices for humans? Quote unquote input devices. You can go ahead and type it into chat. Eyes. You'll notice that eyes is usually the first sense organ that most people mention. Ears are usually second. We will see in this course over and over that humans are primarily visual creatures. Most of interaction with technology is visual. Okay, eyes, ears, nose. So we're mentioning anatomical features. Let's focus on, I asked for input devices, so that's fair. Okay. Skin, touch. Did we get them all? Eyes, ears, nose, skin. What are we missing? Mouth for taste, right? Okay. As we were taught in school, the 5 senses, I think we have them covered. You have a 6th sense, and a 7th and an 8th. What are we missing? You all have it. What you'll see over and over again in this course, awareness of body position, right? The kinesthetic sense, exactly, which is provided by sense organs or sensory cells distributed in your muscles and ligaments. So they're inside the body. We're going to spend a lot of time in this course talking about interoceptive sensors, interoception, internal sensation. Traditionally, interactive technology has nothing to do with your internal feelings, because obviously we don't have interactive technologies inside our bodies, at least not yet. But with the rise of cybernetic prosthetics and implants, that will be changing. Okay, what about output devices? How do we cause change to our environment? Let's focus on the output device. What aspect of your body allows you to cause change on the environment? Voice, and your voice is produced by vocal cords. Vocal cords are vibrated, and they're vibrated by Your mouth is moved by, your hands are moved by, your legs are moved by. Ultimately, the brain, yeah, that's a good point. Robert says muscles here. So we're going to focus on muscles as sort of your output device. Your brain supplies energy and electricity to the muscles, causing them to contract, which causes the various parts of your body to move, which causes an impact on your environment. So again, at a very high level, humans have 5 or more types of input devices, but strictly speaking, only one kind of output device, which is muscle. Muscle drives almost everything we do. There's a few exceptions, and we may talk about that later. Okay, let's talk about input and output devices for computers. What are input devices for computers? How does a computer draw in information about the outside world? Keyboard, right? Not usually, again, usually number one, keyboard and mouse, the historical bread and butter of input devices. More recently, cameras. What else? How else do computers draw in information about the outside world? Network adapters, exactly. LiDAR, that's a good example, yep. So using lasers to pull in information about objects that are close or far away from you. Scanner, microphone, touchscreen, leap motion, exactly. So for many, many decades, there were basically 2 input devices, keyboards and mouse. Before that, there were punch cards. But in just the last few years, the number of types of input devices has proliferated and seems to be accelerating. Okay, what about output devices? How do computers project information out into the world? Hopefully that's picked up by human users. Screen. Screen is usually mentioned first because, again, we are primarily visual creatures. Speakers is usually second because our secondary sense that we rely on is our auditory sensation. Vibration, exactly. Okay. Haptics, that's a good one. We'll spend a fair bit of time talking about haptics. Networking, again. Okay. Okay, so as promised, throughout this course, you're going to see these red boxes, which are empty on your version of the slide deck and are filled in mine. This is not meant to be a prod for you to madly type in or write down everything you see in my version of the slide deck. This is just meant to be a reminder that you should be annotating these empty red boxes as we go in any way you see fit, or doing so after class when you watch the lecture video. Some quiz questions may be drawn from material that are inside these red boxes. Again, it doesn't have to be exactly what's in mine. Okay, so we've just talked about the similarities between humans and interactive technology, which is they both have quote-unquote input and output devices. But that is basically where the similarity between humans and computers ends. We're going to spend most of this course talking about the differences between these 2 types of agents. What differences exist, just if we talk about input and output devices or channels? What's different about the way that input devices work for humans, our input devices work, compared to input devices for computers or output devices? Sampling rate, okay. So your sense organs sense change in the environment at a certain frequency or a certain rate in time, which is often different from computers. What other differences exist? So more biological for humans, of course, because we are biological. What is it about biological input devices, biological sense organs, like eyes and ears and smell, that differs from input devices for computers? Analog versus digital. This is an important one, right? Most of the information we type into a computer is digital. Either somebody pressed the return key or they didn't. Not the amount of pressure. although that is changing. A touch screen, some touch screens can record the amount of pressure. Feedback rate, again, some of these input devices for computers are relatively slow, some quickly. Ability to repair, that's a good one, right? So luckily, most of our biological components are self-repairing, not so for computers. I'm going to change this question slightly. Humans use their sense organs to extract information about the world, and computers use their input devices to extract information from the world. What differs in the way these two types of agents use their input devices to extract information from the world? Not differences in the devices themselves, but the way that humans or computers use their input devices. Computers almost exclusively take data from humans. That's true. Yes, exactly. That's not necessarily true for us. Autonomy. Wenbo, what do you mean by autonomy? If you can expand on that in chat, that would be great. Difference in processor. Yeah, okay. So the brains of these two different types of agents are different. Ethan, what do you mean by agency? I'm talking about the differences in the way in which we use these. Free will. We'll talk about free will a little bit later. Humans can focus on one input device. We will talk about the human capability for attention. So some of you may be wearing a watch right now, but you may not be aware of the pressure that watch is imposing on the skin of your wrist. You are able effortlessly to ignore it, but now that I'm talking about the watch on your wrist, you may be aware of the pressure of your watch on your wrist, right? We can change or direct our attention to various signals that are impinging on our sense organs. What other differences exist? So computers can obviously also change their attention, but that requires us to write some code. Computers almost have to wait for input. So as Nolan mentions here, this is one of the most profound differences that we're going to focus on in this class. Most interactive technologies are passive. They have to wait for information to arrive at their sense organs, versus humans, which are not. They are active. Which you may or may not agree with. Most of you are sitting relatively comfortably, I hope, and passively listening to this lecture. So you may feel as if you are passive and information is passively arriving at your sense organs. But as we will see in this course, that is definitely not the case. That is an illusion that your mind is casting for you. There are things that's exclusive for humans, so we can alter the way we respond to incoming information based on emotion or our hormone levels. That is definitely true. What does it mean to be active with our input devices? How can we actively exploit our input devices to extract more information from the world? What do we do using our output device, our muscles, to exploit our input devices to broaden the net that we cast with our sense organs? Change position to gain more information. Exactly. So if we were in a classroom, those of you sitting in the back row, you would be occluded by students that are sitting closer. If I want to create eye contact with those sitting towards the back of the room, I will try and move my head to see you. Most of you are occluded by the fact that you have your video turned off, such is life. That's a good example, Thomas. What other examples exist? What other kinds of actions do you perform to gain more information from your sense organs? Humans are active creatures. Most interactive technologies for the moment are somewhat passive, or mostly passive. Let's focus on skin for a moment. This should say skin, not touch. Skin is sort of the black sheep of the 5 sense organs. It tends to be last or close to last. However, your skin, the largest organ you possess, is able to extract a wide range of physical phenomena like touch. So binary information is something in contact with your body or not. Pressure, a continuous value. Your skin can tell you something about temperature. It's not very accurate, but within a few degrees. How does skin give you information about texture? How does your sense organ tell you when it's in contact with something? Friction. Friction comes about when you move your skin across an object, right? So the object may be in motion, which will give you texture information, but you can choose to rub an object in a certain way to extract texture. Whether you're aware of it or not, the way you choose to move, the particular actions you take, the direction and velocity, rotation of your hand in contact with an object, your brain is generating that action in a particular way to extract, to maximize the extraction of information. So yes, the information is coming in through nerve endings under your skin, but that only works if your skin is in motion relative to the touched object. What other kinds of actions can you take to broaden the net of your skin? There are things other than pressure, temperature, and texture. So Braille is a great example, absolutely. You do this all the time. You act in certain ways to expand or broaden the net of your sense organs, although you're not usually aware that you're doing so. You will have to be aware of those processes if you're going to design interactive systems to allow users to do that. As I mentioned, skin is not very good about telling temperature. It's also not very good about telling wind direction. I realize we're all indoors at the moment. How can you affect your skin so that it is more sensitive to wind direction? If you go outside and you're wondering about which direction the wind is blowing, what can you do? Lick your finger and hold it up, right? So there's a pretty non-obvious, when you think about it, action that is exploiting some specific aspect of your sense organ. What is it about dampness on the skin that tells you something about wind direction? Again, you may not have ever thought about it. Heat change and evaporation, right? So a thin layer of moisture on the skin will rapidly change temperature if there's wind buffeting it, and it is also evaporating within a few seconds if the layer of moisture is thin enough, right? So the more you think about it, it's a pretty sophisticated interaction with the environment that humans actively exploit all the time. Every tool that any human has ever built, starting with stone axes, is also a product of our actions, and those actions are meant to cause change on the world, which alter the kinds of inputs we receive back. Maybe that interaction from output on the world through a tool, through an interaction with that tool, with the environment back to the sense organs, is very indirect. But in essence, that is what a lot of our tools are designed to do, is to allow us to see or sense the world better. Okay, so up till now, in this cartoon here, we have input arriving at, we have input arriving at the human or interactive technology, some cogitation or computation, and then output on to the world. It seems so obvious a way of thinking about humans and also computers that, again, most of us don't ever think about it. But we're going to start our historical journey today with B.F. Skinner, who is one of the reasons why we tend to think this way. Before Skinner, the study of animal behavior and human behavior was basically natural history. People would go out into the environment of the animal, observe the animal in its natural environment, pose hypotheses about that animal. For example, is that animal capable of learning? or not, and observe that animal and try and answer that question. However, the environments of most animals and humans are very complex. There are a lot of variables. There are a lot of physical phenomena impinging on the sense organs of animals. They have very complex musculatures, very different and complex behaviors and ways of impacting their environment. So B.F. Skinner was a psychologist who in the 1930s said, why don't we try and simplify the environment of an animal so we can restrict the kinds of inputs that animal receives and restrict the kinds of outputs they can produce. And based on what we observe of the relationship between input and output, we can deduce something about the behavior or behavioral capabilities of that animal. Okay, some of you may have seen a Skinner box before. This is sort of an idea that's entered into popular culture. Here's an example of an experiment we might wish to carry out with the Skinner box. Let's imagine we have pigeons and we want to know whether pigeons are capable of operant conditioning, which is a fancy word for a type of learning. How do we use the Skinner box to test that hypothesis? Is this animal capable of learning? Well, we could, for example, intermittently flash a light inside a darkened Skinner box, and the pigeon can either peck lever 1, lever 2, or do nothing. If the pigeon pecks lever 2, we will put a little bit of food into the box. If the pigeon pecks lever 1 or neither of the levers, we provide no food. If we do this over and over again, shine light, if lever 2, then release food. If we do that and we collect information from not the animal itself, but from things happening at the input layer and the output layer, what data might suggest to us that this pigeon is in fact capable of operant conditioning or learning? What would we expect to see in the data? Imagine I gave you a data set, which is the times at which we turned on the light, the times at which lever 1 and or lever 2 went down, and the times at which we input the food, and you were able to see those events occurring over time. What would you look for in the data to convince you that this animal is actually learning? Light and lever 2 converge, right? Exactly. So if this pigeon is smart, every time it sees the light, it should immediately peck lever 2 to release the food, right? Pretty straightforward. Okay, makes a lot of sense, very appealing to someone of a scientific mindset. And as we can see, we've greatly restricted this animal to input. The animal does something and has an effect on output. We can, of course, put a human in a Skinner box as well and ask the same kinds of question, which again suggests or reinforces this idea that humans are animals and ultimately the smart technologies that we created, like computers, should take input, think about it, then do something and have an impact on the environment. 6 years after B.F. Skinner introduced behaviorism, or the Skinner box, Alan Turing introduced the Turing machine, which very different from the Skinner box, but has something in common, which in 1936 was still just a thought experiment, and there wasn't a physical machine yet. The Turing machine also would receive some input, do some information processing, and then some output. Let's try and be a little bit more specific of that. In a couple of sentences, what does a Turing machine do? Most of the computer scientists here should be able to answer this relatively quickly. The Turing machine doesn't exist in a vacuum. There is this external tape. What does a Turing machine do? What is its input? What is its processing? And what is its output? What kinds of outputs is it capable of? It reads and writes a tape, yeah? So reading some symbol from the current position on the tape, that's the input. and writing to the tape is the output, what's going on in between? How does the Turing machine know what symbol to write to the tape? State transitions. So internal state of the Turing machine, it has some internal state. That internal state can be influenced by the symbol that it just read from the tape. If it transitions to a state, that new state may dictate what symbol it writes to the tape. What other action, aside from writing to the tape, are most Turing machines capable of? It moves the tape left and right, exactly, right? So even in computers, or even before computers even existed, there was this idea of movement or action. So for many people, the Turing machine was not a passive machine that would sit there and receive a tape. For some people, it was the Turing machine that moved relative to the tape. It might seem like an arbitrary distinction, but given what we've said over the last few minutes, a passive machine sits and waits for the tape to pass by. An active machine moves relative to the tape. It's interesting to think, if you're of a historical mindset, whether Turing was influenced by Skinner. In both cases, in both animals or humans and machines, there was this emphasis right from the beginning on input, cogitation or computation, and then output. Okay, again, this is just meant to show you sort of the level of detail we're looking for in the description of the Turing machine. Okay, basic idea, some input, some output, and some internal processing. Okay, so we've been moving sort of slowly through the beginning of the 20th century. We're now going to take a step back in time to the 19th century and talk about the philosopher John Dewey. John Dewey is famous for many things. He is arguably one of the most influential American philosophers. He also had a lot of important things to say about education. Some of his thoughts on philosophy and pedagogy, or education, came together in an article called The Reflex Arc in Psychology that he wrote at the very end of the 19th century. In Dewey's own words, we begin not with the sensory stimulus, we begin not with the input, but with a sensor-motor coordination. In a certain sense, it's the movement which is primary and the sensation which is secondary. In Dewey, this would have meant that the sensation came after the movement. The movement of the body, head, and eye muscles determining the quality of what is experienced. This was a very profound statement that was given long before this idea of focusing on input first, then output. For Dewey, it was opposite. Output comes first. Output influences the environment, and that change on the environment is then sensed by the human. And it is that action, the movement of the body, that determines the quality of what arrives on our input channels, that arrives on our sense organs. He refers to this as the arc, which maybe wasn't the best choice of words. What we're really looking for is what he called coordination here, or a circle. A human, all of us, since the day we were born, we are acting on the environment, whether we're aware of it or not. We are pushing against the environment, literally and figuratively, and we are observing the results of our actions. The environment pushes back. I'm going to use this turn of phrase many times throughout this semester. We push against the world, and we observe how the world pushes back. That loop, or that cycle, or that arc, if you want, is the building block for everything else we do. That is how we learn about the world. That is how we adapt to the world. That is how we survive in a challenging world. However, thinking that way requires us to break our bad habit of thinking of behavior as linear or passive. Input passively arriving at a human or a technology and being translated into output. In everything we do from now on in this course, we are going to try and think of this as a continuous loop. In a continuous loop, there is no real beginning and end, although Dewey did talk about action first, then sensation. Again, most of us have 20, 30, 40 years of experience of this continuous loop running all the time, regardless of whether we are awake or asleep. Based on the raw data that we have generated through that process over the decades, we have built up expectations of this reflex arc. I expect that when I send commands to my muscle to raise my hand and I feel strain sensors or strain cells in my body that tell me, the interoceptive signal inside my body telling me that my arm actually is rising, I have an expectation about what's going to happen, which is that I will see my hand enter my visual field. If I send commands to my arm to raise my arm in front of my body, I feel the sensation in my arm that my arm is actually rising, and I do not see my hand appear at the bottom of my visual field. I am going to be very surprised and probably pretty upset. There are expectations we have all the time about our interactions with the environment. Luckily, most of the time those expectations are met and we calmly go about our day. Sometimes those expectations are not met and we become curious. We focus our attention, as we just talked about, we focus our attention on that surprising event. Or that expectation is broken in a pretty serious way and we run for our lives, or we are very upset. Okay, so again, in this continuous loop, we have built up huge expectations. One important, or probably the most important aspect of our external environment are other people. So as somebody was mentioning earlier in the chat, we also have social expectations. When you're talking with another human being, assuming that you can see the face of the listener, you have certain expectations from them. And if those expectations are broken, you might change your mode of operation. If you're trying to engage your friends in conversation, and as you speak, you see their eyes wander away from your face to something else, that's usually a telling signal about how to change this loop. Okay, so a lot of what we're going to do in HCI is try and understand the less obvious aspects of these expectations drawn from the physical world or the social world and build them into our expectations with our devices. Humans, whether they realize it or not, they want their devices to act more or less like the physical or social environment. When you move your mouse and there's the cursor on the screen, if it does not respond immediately, that's pretty upsetting or frustrating. I expect my hand to immediately appear in my visual field when I feel my hand in front of my face. If there was some lag in that process, I again would be pretty upset. Okay, it might take you a while to wrap your mind around thinking about interactions, especially with technology where movement is primary and then sensation is secondary. You can convince yourself of this process. Again, if you have any roommates or dorm mates, we mentioned the Leap Motion device. Plug the Leap Motion device in, turn on the visualizer, put the Leap Motion device on the desk in front of your friend and say nothing and see what they do. They may sit there for a while, maybe a few seconds waiting for something to happen, but after a few seconds, movement will become primary. They will grab the device, pick it up, touch the top, wave their hand over it, and expect something to happen. Okay. All right, so let's think about this coordination. Obviously, this kind of coordination can take very different forms depending on what the person is trying to do or what they would like to use the technology to do, because it would be difficult or impossible to do that task otherwise. Here's a very traditional thing. You might need to do some research. You jump onto the web. You have a certain idea in mind, like you want to think about new energy policies for Vermont. You already come in with an idea about biofuels. You start Googling biofuels. You learn a little bit about it, and based on what the computer gives you back, you alter your idea. Maybe now you're thinking a little bit more about wind and solar. You Google those terms. You get some information back, and around this loop you go. If you're Googling something, the iterations through this loop may be a few seconds or a few minutes. You type something into Google, you read what you get back, type something else, read what you get back. It is a discrete and more or less digital interaction, the information that's coming back. Most of HCI was kind of focused on this idea for a long time, web designs, search engines, and so on. Now we are moving much more into a very different kind of interaction, and most focus in HCI is on continuous, ubiquitous, and environmental interaction. We just talked about embedded devices. Your smartphone is obviously the most important embedded device any of us have. Your smartphone, sometimes it acts like a computer. It waits for you to type something onto the screen. Other times it acts like an embedded device where it is directly sensing the environment, whether you know it or not. It may be sensing position, and that position may be changing because you are interacting with the environment. So the feedback loop in a smartphone, assuming you're carrying your smartphone, is piggybacking on this interaction. And a lot of the smartest apps that are out there are exploiting assumptions about this loop. Okay, so again, I used to give this as a hypothetical example in class. I don't know if there's an app that does this, but we're getting pretty close to this. You're walking down the street and your phone is detecting change in your GPS position, and it detects you're moving relatively close to a Starbucks. It's able to infer that maybe that's your destination, even if you haven't typed this into Google Maps, because maybe you tweeted something about caffeine or you visited that Starbucks multiple times before. It infers that's where you're going. The phone, it assumes that you're heading towards a Starbucks, but you may not be aware. It infers you don't know that there's a Starbucks nearby. So it buzzes your leg, it politely interrupts you and indicates that there's a Starbucks nearby. And the minute after you read the notification from the app notices that the change in position has changed. So you've deflected your trajectory and you're now walking towards the Starbucks without you having to tell your app. It's going to infer now you're headed towards the Starbucks. However, now your phone realizes that based on your usage history and how long you tend to spend in Starbucks, for example, you're not going to make it home before your battery flats out. So your phone buzzes your leg again to let you know, you alter course, and so on. So there are these periodic interruptions that look a lot like these periodic feedback loops between the human and the smartphone in this case, but there are also a lot of continuous interactions going on here. You are continuously moving through your environment as this interaction is playing out. Your phone is directly or indirectly altering that continuous interaction of you with your physical environment and drawing conclusions about your behavior or your desires based on that. As we know with technologies often assume wrong, and when they do, it's extremely frustrating. So again, the phone has to also decide whether it makes sense to interrupt you or not. Okay, I've been doing a lot of talking. I'll just take a break for a moment. Any questions, comments, ideas, additions? All good? Okay, so up till now, again, I've been talking about computers. I'm going to try and stop talking about computers and talk about interactive systems instead, because we're going to study things other than computers in this class. Just as a reminder, an embedded device is any kind of computer or computational device that has sensors. It can directly sense the world with or without a human as an intermediary. And finally, robots. So a computational device that can sense the world directly without having to wait for input from a user and can act directly on the world. Okay. In order to qualify to be an interactive system, obviously it must interact with a person, and it must be able to internally process information in some way. So we want to make sure that this admittedly broad term interactive system is not too broad. A knapsack also assuming you're wearing it, maintains a continuous interactive loop with the human wearer. The human does something with their muscles. They put books into their backpack, which immediately changes the weight of the knapsack, which sends directly a signal, a physical signal, back to the human, which is an increased load on the shoulders. We are not going to consider a knapsack an interactive system because it is not doing any internal data processing. Okay, a cell phone is an interactive system. Okay. All right, as I mentioned last time, what you'll find is that this course is relatively broad, not necessarily very deep. HCI has one foot planted in psychology, or the human side of things, and the other foot planted in technology. And because of that, HCI draws on a lot of different fields of study and human endeavors. As promised, we're going to spend a fair bit of time talking about people. We've already started talking about human psychology. The brain is a prediction machine. Whenever we interact with the physical environment or other people or technology, our brain has an expectation or a prediction of how that interaction is going to go. And based on how the world pushes back, our brains assess whether that prediction was supported or foiled and decides what to do next. We'll look a little bit at sociology. What are some of the unspoken expectations we have when we interact with other people? We'll talk about ergonomics. So this will take us into the subjective or the aesthetic side of HCI. What is the literal or metaphorical fit between people and the things they use? So there's been a lot of work on the ergonomics of smartphones. We want to make sure that smartphones fit into the daily lives of people. What are some physical aspects of smartphones that have changed over the years to create a better fit between people and their phones? Not the software, the hardware itself. The size, right? For a long time, smaller was better, up to a point. And now for some smartphones, we've reversed. Yeah, weight is important. We may allow larger phones as long as they provide more functionality. Rounded edges, that's a good one. That's a great aspect of ergonomics. Why rounded edges? Why does that matter? What was the design decision behind rounded edges? It's not immediately obvious what it is. So selfie camera, obviously you find that on all devices, but it's not quite about the fit. Corners are ouch, yes, right? So maybe something about being safe. There's another reason that cell phones have rounded corners, or another design decision that influenced why cell phones have rounded edges. More futuristic, maybe. Yeah, exactly. Maybe it appeals to some aspect of human psychology. Doesn't get caught on things like pockets or bags, right? So it was immediately obvious with cell phones that these were things that people were going to put in their pockets. And you probably experience this with your keys. It gets frustrating when you have to reach in, when you're pulling something out of your pocket 20 or 30 times a day, for better, for worse, which we do with our phones. If they keep snagging on the inside of pockets, not such a great thing, right? Again, maybe a minor detail, but again, it suggests this gray area about things that are not so obvious, but are very important. It has to do with thinking carefully about the physical context of people. People have pockets and things can get snagged on them. Okay, culture also influences design of interactive technology. We'll talk about that later. Obviously, technological considerations also matter. We're going to talk about lots of different kinds of hardware platforms. It's going to require us to delve into electronics, software engineering, multimedia, databases, sensors, and motors when things can actually move, some coding, networking. These things we're all pretty familiar with. On the other hand, of the objective, straightforward technological considerations, we're also going to have to spend some time thinking about design and the subjective or the aesthetic sides of technology. Rounded corners on cell phones has an ergonomic reason. But it also, again, appeals to our aesthetic sense. Someone said maybe it's more futuristic to have things with rounded corners. What are aspects of design that appeal to human psychology and human aesthetic sense? We'll look at interactive design, 3D design, design considerations drawn from engineering if we're building physical things, graphic design if we're building graphical things like Gapminder, product design if we're building things like cell phones or leap motion devices. We got 1 minute left, so let's finish with activities and contexts. We're not just thinking about people, but we're thinking about what people do. And we're going to really focus on things that people do, although they're not aware that they're doing it. So soft systems are things like businesses or universities. Inside organizations, like organizational psychology, a lot of the way in which it works is unwritten. So a lot of the rituals or the things you're used to at the university have all been disrupted because few of us are now on campus. So a lot of our communities of practice or our tribal knowledge has gone out the door, and we're going to have to build new social norms around remote instruction. Again, a great object lesson in HCI. Okay, I think we will stop there today. Just as a reminder, you have a quiz due at 11:59 p.m. Tonight. You are working on deliverable 1, which is due this coming Monday, 11:59 p.m. And I will see you back here on Teams Tuesday morning. Thanks very much, everyone. See you later.